y quiero agradecer muy especialmente a Google, a Richard Gingras, que siempre estuvo dispuesto, siempre está dispuesto. Yo creo que es la quinta vez, si no me equivoco, que lo tenemos a Richard en una reunión de la CIP, y justamente lo tuvimos en octubre pasado. Quiero también decir que esta misma invitación la hemos hecho a Meta y otras organizaciones, y no hemos tenido la suerte de contar con ellos en este espacio, para lo cual habla muy bien de esta búsqueda de diálogo y de esta mesa de diálogo que estuvimos buscando con Google en octubre pasado. Sin más, ahora ya para un cierre de estos temas, antes de que tengamos el privilegio de tener al presidente de Bolivia, Tuto Quiroga, y al presidente de la CIP, y también a Martín, para ir cerrando esta tarde, quiero presentarles a Roberto Rock, vicepresidente segundo de la Sociedad Interamericana de Prensa, quien tendrá el placer de presentar a Richard y moderar el debate con él. Muchas gracias, Roberto.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo. Saludos a todos y a todas.
¿Roberto?
Sí, ¿me escucha, Ricardo?
Ahora sí, ahora. Empieza
Okay.
de nuevo, por favor.
No, solamente para agradecerte, Ricardo, agradecer a CIP esta invitación nuevamente y mandar un saludo muy afectuoso a todos los compañeros y a las compañeras que están con nosotros esta tarde. Entiendo que estamos esperando la entrada de Richard Gingras.
Él ya está, Roberto, lo puedes presentar. Richard ya hace un rato que está con nosotros.
Muy bien. Pues bueno, saludos a Richard Gingras, que no requiere presentación, presidente de Google News, y como dice Ricardo Trotti, una presencia que ha estado abierto siempre a conversar con nosotros. Se están cumpliendo casi 6 meses después de que el 21 de octubre pasado lo tuvimos en una sesión casi idéntica a esta, conversando sobre el panorama de los debates que en distintas regiones del mundo se están desarrollando en torno a un punto que creo que es común para todos los actores, que es la necesidad de contar con prensa independiente, con prensa de calidad, con un periodismo que tenga acto de presencia en el fortalecimiento y vigencia de nuestras democracias. Creo que en eso no tenemos discrepancia alguna, y creo que ambas partes nos reconocemos también el interés en este eje común, en el que tendríamos que seguir construyendo acuerdos. Sin embargo, en estos últimos 6 meses, el debate en torno a la polémica que encaran de alguna manera medios de comunicación y las grandes plataformas tecnológicas, en particular Google, no ha hecho más que crecer por la vía de discusiones, pero también por la vía de iniciativas específicas de ley, por un crecimiento de las discusiones, de la polémica en diversas regiones del mundo. Acabamos de cerrar una mesa maravillosa, dijo Ricardo, apasionante, pero yo también, donde representantes de la prensa de Europa, de Estados Unidos, de Canadá, de Brasil, nos han planteado cuáles son los caminos que se están siguiendo en materia de legislaciones para de alguna manera obligar a las plataformas tecnológicas a sentarse con los medios de distintas latitudes a buscar acuerdos en torno a la posibilidad de que las plataformas reconozcan una obligación de bonificar a los medios un porcentaje de sus ingresos publicitarios para dar cuenta de su respeto a temas como derechos de autor o propiedad intelectual. Es un debate que Google ha encarado también de diversas maneras. Está a la disposición de ustedes la reunión del pasado 21 de octubre. Pero en este entorno nos es realmente muy importante conocer el enfoque que sobre este nuevo clima, un clima creciente, yo diría que enrarecido, sobre este debate, tiene Richard Gingras y tiene Google. Nuevamente le agradecemos a Richard su compañía esta tarde con nosotros y le damos el uso de la palabra, por favor.
I'm pleased to speak with you again at the Inter-American Press Association General Assembly. When we gathered 6 months ago, I talked about how much the world has changed over the past few years, including the accelerated transformation the news industry has been undergoing. As you just heard from previous discussions, regulation of technology platforms and news is also accelerating. Over the past 20 years, we've collaborated closely with the news industry and provided billions of dollars to support the creation of quality journalism in the digital age. We are committed to play our part, to be a constructive ally that enables a sustainable, independent, and diverse news ecosystem. The task ahead, in my view, is one of shared responsibility, together with publishers, civil society, and governments. A sustainable news industry is necessary for strong democracies. We recognize that. So it's imperative that we are collectively successful. But to be successful, we must engage in fact-based discussions regarding regulatory processes. And we must recognize that consumer habits around news have changed, and we must all adapt. And over the next 20, 25 minutes, I'd like to address that full span of issues facing us, not just the regulatory ones. In 1974, I worked at the Public Broadcasting Service in Washington. We were building the first satellite network to deliver television programs to stations across the United States. Until then, distributing programs to television stations was costly and cumbersome. Using telephone lines was hugely expensive. Tapes were often shipped serially from station to station. Using satellites would change the face of television. It enabled dozens of new programming networks. It laid the foundation for the explosion of cable television. The number of channels in the United States multiplied from 5 to 500 within a decade. I was there in the room when Ted Turner introduced the first all-news channel, CNN. His objective was to deepen news coverage, expand beyond 2-minute stories. Since then, Turner's vision for dedicated news channels has devolved from thoughtful coverage to inexpensive and more combative opinion programming. At the beginning, there were channels for a wide array of special audiences. Today, the programming is reality shows and shark attacks, all owned by a handful of large media companies. The expanded distribution of cable was left in the hands of a few, which in the mind of some was the rightful order of things. What's my point? The fight for share of voice will happen no matter the means of distribution. Those with real or perceived influence, be they governments or the private sector, will give no quarter to maintain and expand their share of voice, their share of influence. Tim Wu in The Master Switch crafted a superb analysis of how this happens at every stage of evolving distribution, be it the growth of telephony, expanding radio from AM to FM, the introduction of cable, and now the internet. The internet expanded access to distribution. It lowered the bar, eliminated the friction for any voice seeking an audience. The audience might have to find you, but you can be found, word can be spread, new audiences can meet new voices. It was the dream of free expression purists. At the dawning of the internet, many, including me, were optimistic. We believed that the more broad our free expression rights, the better. We believed our better angels would win, but we learned there was a dark side. We're not all angels. The internet has enabled challenging and problematic behaviors. Understandably, governments are beginning to regulate the internet, typically with good intentions, but often with unintended consequences, potentially damaging the free press and the openness of the internet, which leads to the fundamental question we face. How can we assure that evolving internet policy will enable an open and diverse press and not reinforce a special political interests or prop up a legacy industry? Some participants in the policy discussion see the internet as a threat to their share of voice, their share of influence. They'd rather turn the internet into a distribution environment like those that enabled their earlier success, where share of voice went to those with power and influence to command distribution. Some would also like to see more friction between new voices and the audiences they seek. They would prefer to see core concepts of free linking and fair use curtailed. They may campaign with words about protecting journalism, but the bottom line is a desire to maintain prior dominance, to constrain the openness of the web, to reduce the diversity of voices it enables. We support thoughtful regulation. We hope that it respects these three key principles: protect the open web and the open internet and the free expression it enables, and not a closed distribution system favoring the few. Enable an open and diverse free press, and protect against undue government influence that imbalances the news ecosystem. As you've heard from previous speakers, regulation is underway in a number of countries around the world. It's difficult to balance regulation and support the complex news industry, fight misinformation, and enable citizens to access authoritative information. When looking at the proposed regulations being considered in Brazil, Canada, and the United States, some common challenges have emerged. What are regulators trying to solve for? The demise of the legacy model or sustainable new models? Asking a search engine to pay for links is self-defeating, as is the case with proposals in Brazil and Canada. It's like asking a newsstand to pay a newspaper for the privilege of selling it. It will limit diversity of voice. It will constrain freedom of the press that we fight to enable. It constrains the principles of the open web. It will reduce the ability of citizens to find diverse sources of journalism. It's troubling to suggest the objective is to enable a sustainable press, but instead limit the ability of citizens to find diverse voices of journalistic expression. It makes me sad to hear an association or industry lobbyist make false claims while purporting to defend journalism. Do publishers and journalists and their associations and lobbyists accept the dangers of government involvement in the press? There are better ways to address this. Do large publishers recognize the impact on new and diverse voices, or is that the objective those large publishers are looking to achieve? What constitutes journalism? It's not clear by most regulatory definitions. The fine print is critical. Is it only legacy publications, thus limiting new and diverse voices? Do websites with little or no original reporting make the cut, thus spreading the money across a near limitless number of publications? Do sites that promote low-quality information or clickbait qualify, thus fueling misinformation and making it harder for people to trust the news they're reading? What exceptions are there? Will legislation that purports to address misinformation but creates an exception for politicians and any spin master calling themselves a journalist be effective? Will legislation proposed by legacy interests seeking a return to their era of dominance constrain the openness of the web and the opportunity for a more diverse free press? These are challenging questions. The world has changed. More than ever, societies need quality journalism to understand their world and express their roles as citizens. The internet overwhelms us. It continues to change, click by click, with every glob of media it spits out. From the sweet memes of social networks to an endless array of opinionators and influencers. From the helpful tutorials and inspired dreams of video creators to hucksters and propagandists. From snapshots of cute grandkids to doctored photos of false righteous indignation. From thoughtful forays into innovative digital journalism to astroturf journalism funded by who knows who. It's a complicated media ecosystem composed of frightening simplicity. Our culture, our politics, and news. reduced to memes and 280-character sound bites lacking context and substance. Our world is twisted and torqued by daunting cultural memes we are induced to amplify, by bad ads offering false remedies, by politicians igniting fears he or she pledges to extinguish. Yes, there is thoughtful, fact-based journalism sprinkled in, hard to identify and largely overwhelmed by the cacophonous, mind-numbing cicada buzz that is the collective expression of the internet. How does journalism perform its critical role in the midst of all that? How might we better understand how journalism is perceived by the societies we serve? Do our audiences understand the role of journalism? Do they know what is fact-based journalism and what is not? Which sources to trust with their precious time and money? Is the explosion of inexpensive but popular opinion smothering the credibility of fact-based coverage? Is the drift towards partisan news making the problem worse? Do they understand what we think they understand? News sites make earnest pledges about the importance of local news or the virtues of quality journalism. What small percentage of our societies understands any of that? Yes, we can demand more media literacy, but telling us 19 reasons we should eat more broccoli and less pizza is not enough. We need to explore new recipes for an enticing and healthy journalistic menu. How might news organizations better understand the needs of their communities? I ask publishers what research they do. Typically, the answer is not much or none. We study our logs, we analyze our traffic. Okay, but that says nothing about those who don't visit, nothing about what the audience values. One friend, a managing editor, told me, I understand what my readers want. Now, I wasn't about to pass judgment on my friend's wisdom. I only asked, don't you expect your reporters to ask lots of questions before deciding what they know or don't know about an issue? Well, so why not do the research? What information do communities need on a daily basis? What will drive their interests? What will build ties within the community? What will they value? What will they pay for? Do they respect the source? We've been working with emerging local news outlets around the world. We recently funded 37 local news research projects with our North American Innovation Challenge. Most of the 51 projects we supported through 2 rounds of the Latin American Innovation Challenge are innovative approaches to answer those questions. I've learned from the success of publishers like City News in Italy and Village Media in Canada. City News and Village both found sustainable success through deep engagement with their communities by thoughtfully addressing their community's comprehensive information needs. Their success points to an opportunity that many local news entrepreneurs can benefit from. Accountability journalism is critical to the role of journalism, but community events, local sports, obituaries also matter. Many of you know this. It's this service journalism that drives engagement, builds community ties, and enables local advertising. It's useful and it's valued. It expands the audience for the accountability journalism that you do provide. As David Walmsley of Canada's Globe and Mail noted, might we underpin the high church work with respect and mutual accommodation for all of a community's information needs? How can journalism rebuild trust? 8 years ago, I joined Sally Lehrman to call for a focus on the declining trust in journalism. With the Trust Project, Sally has generated research, brought ideas, and assembled principles and playbooks to guide news organizations on approaches to transparency and trust. She's worked with hundreds of news organizations around the world. But as Sally would admit, there's more to learn, there's more to do. Ulrik Hagerup and the Constructive Journalism Institute in Denmark pursues a different angle, rethinking the models, the formats, the linguistics used in our journalistic work. We supported the Constructive Journalism Institute and will continue to do so. The word constructive is key. It's not news that makes you feel good. Constructive journalism goes beyond the typical coverage model with clear signals and clear intent, to include the necessary context, the hows and the whys, and importantly, a consideration of how that calamitous event could have been prevented. It's designed to seek common ground. When staging debates, they avoid divisive terminology like crossfire. What better way to gain society's respect than by demonstrating the power of journalism to help a community understand its challenges and address them? Let's go further on how a society understands its challenges. How can journalism avoid amplifying a society's distorted sense of risk? In the United States, we are 400 times more likely to die in a traffic accident than an act of terrorism. We are 35 times as likely to die from cancer or heart disease than from a violent death in any form. Yet research tells us we perceive those fears in reverse. Our fear of terrorism is several hundred times higher than dying in our cars. We live in a landscape of distorted risk. We live in a society where our perceived fears are amplified such that we lose sight of our society's real challenges. Every day we read headlines about terrorism, home invasions, kidnappings, refugee flows, all the horrific but anomalistic events that occur in a modern world, and we need to know about them. However unintentional, however, news reporting plays an intrinsic role in molding perceptions of reality that conflict with actual reality. What should really concern me in my community? If I enter a polling booth with a distorted sense of societal risk, might that not skew how I consider various issues or candidates? If we believe the role of journalism is giving citizens the information they need to be informed citizens, might we provide more context? Was there a trend of home invasions, or was it a rare occurrence? Can we close the gap between irrational fear and rational fear? Can we build a foundation of statistical knowledge to help provide context? In the United States, we have a project called Common Knowledge. It's an expansive corpus of data on thousands of topics across the United States. We're working with newsrooms like those of McClatchy to make it easy for journalists to embed that nugget of data-driven context to help distinguish between the disturbing anomaly from a dangerous trend. How might we adapt to the media forms our cultures are adopting? The underlying assumption of a democratic society and the profession of journalism is this: if we express our ideas with the right words and logical arguments, if enough people read those words, then our democracies will be effective. The world will be a better place. But again, the internet and new media forms have rearranged social, political, and cultural structures. We see it with Twitter, we see it with TikTok, we see it with short form video. The messages get shorter, an inescapable progression of how we communicate, how we understand the society we live in. We can't ignore it. Kevin Munger argues that forms of human conversation have an overwhelming influence on what ideas we can conveniently express. And what ideas are convenient to express inevitably become the important content of a culture. I'm not suggesting TikTok is the future of journalism, though even today, in its own crowdsourced way, it is a medium of journalistic expression. I love great long reads. When I encounter a high-functioning, thoughtful coworker who doesn't read long articles, disclaiming them as imposing walls of text, I hear a call to action. At Google, we'll continue to experiment with storytelling tools in formats like web stories to explore how they map to the behaviors of contemporary users. Our language and information constructs change over time. We don't have all the right tools for the job. How do we empower journalists with better tools? In the digital world, knowledge is often hidden in data, and data often hidden behind technical complexity. Can new tools allow reporters to pursue investigations that otherwise are impractical or manually daunting? The Panama Papers and Pandora Papers are extraordinary examples of high-impact data-driven journalism. What makes the work of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists Doubly impressive is how they've empowered collaboration across newsrooms. I sit on their advisory board. It's fascinating to watch them evolve their work. We've made progress at Google with Pinpoint, our tools for investigative journalists that analyze documents, images, hand-scrawled notes to understand and organize them at speed and scale. The Boston Globe recently won a Pulitzer and used Pinpoint as part of that investigation. Every journalist needs better tools, saves their time, increases their superpowers. Last but not least, how can we reach those in our societies who don't care or lost interest? Only 10% of our societies regularly consume what we might call serious news. The Reuters Institute tells us even fewer pay for news. We hear it from our friends. They avoid the news. It makes them sad or anxious or fearful. They find solace in other ways, binging the latest on Netflix or feeding their addiction on TikTok. I do as well. It brings back what Neil Postman said of television in 1985. We are amusing ourselves to death. What George Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Aldous Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban books, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny fail to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In Orwell's 1984, Huxley added, "People are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they're controlled by inflicting pleasure." In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. Both might be true. I suspect you're thinking, Richard didn't mention the business model this time. Everyone says it's broken. It's broken and it's not. Yes, the business model of the metropolitan newspaper will never return. In 1985, newspapers were the internet before there was one. But now we have the internet. Classified ads went to online marketplaces, not Google. That was 30% of the model. Department stores got smothered by e-commerce. Printed discount coupons became loyalty programs. That was 80% of the revenue for a North American newspaper. The internet was the end of that business model, however difficult that might be. And that revenue didn't come to Google. But it's not broken for the journalism entrepreneurs I know. Paula Miraglia didn't launch Nexo Journal in Brazil thinking she had no business model or path to success, nor did Infobae in Argentina. They launched those ventures because they knew there were voids to fill, opportunities to harvest. Many are succeeding, lots of hard work, long nights of stressful doubt, but they believe. And every day we see proof of their belief. It's no longer a question in my mind of whether new news ventures can succeed. Now it's about sharing the formulas of those who have succeeded. How do we scale the success of some to many? With every advance in media distribution, there was an early phase of exploration, failure, success, evolution. Then it became clear what the models for local radio would be, or in their time, alternative weeklies or super savers. We are now at that second phase where successful models can be propagated. Yes, I asked no question relating to the business model, because every question I've asked is critical to a successful news organization, both journalistically and financially. They are foundational. The answers are the path to success, whatever those answers might be. It was one of the great Greeks who said, "Our open societies, our democracies will be destroyed by the freedoms we enable." Wise words. terrifying words. They hit a little too close to home. The political sphere has adapted to the capabilities of the internet to speak to voters, to build political alliances far more quickly and effectively than the world of journalism. We see that impact around the world. We see how many democracies have elected autocratic leaders. The trend is as concerning to me and to Google as it is to you. As I've noted in the past, Google's success is greatest in open societies. The impact of journalism is also greatest in open societies. We have common objectives, a common sense of mission. It's why the hundreds of people at Google who work with news publishers and journalists are passionate about their work. I am passionate about my work. When journalism succeeds, we all do better. Google's commitment is stronger than ever. We want to do more. We plan to do more. The question isn't whether we do more. The question is how we do that and preserve those principles I outlined earlier. I cannot be clear enough about that. And I've done my best to discuss these situations with associations, but frankly, I haven't been given much inroad to do so. I believe through trusted partnership, we'll get there. Right now, the partnership we need seems to be shredding. It's worn by friction. I think that's deeply unhealthy. The relationship must go beyond the transactional. It must go beyond commercial relationships. We need to innovate together. We need to address change together because change will be continuous. We need to understand how each other works and how we can achieve mutual benefit. We're together in this for the long term. Let's figure out how we can go forward in the long term together and not antagonistically separate. Again, as ever, I look forward to further conversations. I think all of you know how to reach me. Glad to discuss further today and beyond today. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, Richard. Gracias por este posicionamiento. Creo que supone un juicio duro frente a los medios de comunicación que, por su parte, también tiene señalamientos importantes, muy críticas hacia las plataformas como Google. Creo que el riesgo es que nos embarquemos en un diálogo de sordos, donde cada quien tenga una retórica sin escuchar a la otra parte. Creo que Jorge Canaguati quería tomar la palabra y hay una intervención de Carlos Jornet en el sentido de que la pregunta concreta de si hay algo que esté invitando por mayor claridad a Google a sentarse a una mesa de negociación para debatir estos temas. Ricardo, ¿podríamos darle voz, abrir el micrófono de Jorge Canaguati, por favor?
Sí, ya no.
No, ya, gracias. Bienvenido, Richard, again, de nuevo a estas reuniones de la CIP. Para nosotros es muy importante que tú estés presente. Comparto con Roberto la expresión reciente en el sentido de que no sean conversaciones sordas. Es importante que las organizaciones mediáticas asociadas a la CIP en este caso, pero del mundo, puedan llegar a tener conversaciones constructivas con plataformas o en el caso de ustedes, en el caso de Google. Ha sido interesante lo que podríamos llamar el lecture, que creo que le llaman en inglés, que nos has dado en periodismo, en la perspectiva de Google. Claro, creo que muchos de esos cuestionamientos son válidos, son preguntas que nos hacemos en el día a día, muchos de los editores, muchos de los periodistas que tratamos de hacer la labor encomendada y que nos hemos ganado la confianza de millones de lectores y millones de audiencias en las diferentes plataformas. Yo no puedo dejar de no hacerte esta pregunta porque creo que lo importante es ir avanzando. Hace 6 meses hablábamos de cómo Showcase iba a ser desarrollado, iba a aportar, tú decías cómo iba a aportar mucho a los medios, particularmente en este caso de nuestro continente, y lo que estamos viendo es que eso no ha avanzado. No se ha visto un despliegue, por lo menos percibido de parte nuestra. Entonces me gustaría saber realmente cuáles son los planes, porque nunca llegamos a tener la oportunidad de discutirlos contigo o con alguien de Google, de cuáles son esos rollout plans o esos planes de despliegue. Tal vez tengo otras preguntas, pero quisiera comenzar por ahí.
Sure. So as I noted in October, we do think Showcase is a very appropriate and effective mechanism to use as we seek to address the challenges we face and address them together. As I said in October, we're pleased to bring that forward, but it's an incredibly uncertain climate in many countries these days, with either the suggestion or the threat or the immediacy of proposed regulation. It's a pretty difficult situation for us to decide to go forward in that context. And what I said in October and what I'll say again today is we're pleased to sit down with any of you. We're pleased to sit down with the associations in any of these countries and discuss how we can go about this. But that's quite difficult in today's climate. And quite frankly, I have not seen those opportunities come forward. The invitation I made is still there. I noticed in the earlier panel, there were comments by two associations that they would like to engage with us, but we have rebuffed them. I frankly have to just sharply disagree. I have attempted many instances over the last 2 years, for instance, in Canada and in the United States, to engage with those associations and been rebuffed. That's unfortunate. I've asked to meet with the board of News Media Canada, been rebuffed. Right? We do think there are constructive paths forward, but we have to talk. We're willing to talk as soon as possible. So let's please do so. But it's quite difficult when we're not engaging directly. And instead, of engaging, I hear, unfortunate statements of inaccuracy about Google stealing content, which is clearly not the case, with the links and snippets that we use in search under existing copyright laws, nor the revenue, which, as we know, yes, the internet changed the economy for advertising. And yes, Google has found success. Google has actually used that success in working with publishers to the tune of generating billions of dollars in advertising revenue. Like when folks cite that notion of 80%, first of all, you need to kind of tear it down and look at the specifics and be accurate about what one is really saying there. Because included within that are the billions of dollars that go back to publishers around the globe. So anyways, but to your point, we'd love to engage. I'd love to engage. I'm not hard to find and would love to do so. And frankly, what troubles me, and you heard what I said. What troubles me is I feel we're going down the road that is in neither of our self-interests. With the kind of regulation we're seeing, the kind of regulation that breaks the internet, the kind of regulation that brings government into the news industry, when over the years, especially in South America and Latin America, that's the last thing you ever wanted to see. So yeah, let's please discuss and try to come to a more sensible approach to how to do these things, rather than the path that we're now on, which I think will be in neither of our short or long-term interests.
Roberto, si me permitís. Roberto, ¿puedo?
Presidente Canaguati, si tienes otra pregunta, pero también quisiera convocar a Paul Digan para alusiones personales, como se dice en los parlamentos, si él quiere tener una intervención. Adelante, presidente Canaguati.
Ok, gracias. Richard, en relación con lo que tú estás diciendo de que no nos hemos encontrado, no entiendo por qué no, porque en el caso de la CIP hemos buscado esas reuniones, hemos pedido esas reuniones, pero creo que ese no es creo que eso no es lo de que hay que discutir hoy. Tal vez a donde yo quisiera mandarte un mensaje de reflexión es evidente que en aquellos casos en que se ha podido establecer una legislación, como en el caso de Australia, los beneficios que se han ido a los medios, la información que surge, que son muchísimos mayores que lo que Google ha estado entregando con sus diferentes programas. Entonces, creo yo que pareciera que estamos estamos obligando a que vayamos por ese camino si no realmente adelantamos esas conversaciones o no se demuestra una intención de poder avanzar y poder abrirse y poder compensar a los medios desde nuestra perspectiva justa y a todos. Lo dejo ahí, perdón, que solo quería, por la respuesta de Richard, quería comentar eso.
So let me add to that. Look, I don't want to, going back and forth with accusations isn't constructive. Going forward is constructive. Yes. I don't recall having anyone from IAPA reach out on this. Not to say it didn't happen. Maybe it didn't happen in the right channels. So let's not bother with that. I did have a very good conversation a few weeks ago with your incoming president. But let's engage. Let's maybe we can get there. On Australia, by the way, I would be careful what you conclude from Australia, because the reports about what happened in Australia, I would say first consider the source and consider what they might be trying to represent what happened in Australia versus what actually happened in Australia. I will note that the former head of the Competition Authority in a recent interview noted that his statements about what happened in Australia financially was speculation on his part. He had no way of knowing. I have no way of knowing. I only know what specifically Google has done. I will tell you this, because here too, I think there has been, disturbing information that's not accurate. The showcase deals we did in Australia are consistent with showcase deals we've done elsewhere in the world. The showcase deals we did in Australia went from large organizations to very small news organizations. There were also, not surprisingly, commercial deals with many publishers, particularly large ones, regard use of our ad technology and so on and so forth, that were also involved in this. And those, again, are standard deals that we'll do elsewhere, right? I think it's very important to us that we be consistent with what we do around the world. And that is indeed our intent. But please be careful about simply accepting speculation about what might have happened in Australia that is not, at least in any of my understanding, and certainly in our participation in how that played out in Australia, is not accurate.
Gracias, Richard. Paul Dean, please.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. Richard, first of all, wonderful to see you again, and look forward to many more productive discussions with you. We certainly, in terms of News Media Canada and our members, a good number of them have struck content licensing agreements with Google, and that's terrific. And really, from our perspective, what we're looking forward to in the legislation in Canada is just bringing more people into, the collective into negotiations with companies on the search and social side. So we certainly welcome discussions with you as this legislation moves forward and beyond.
Yes, and I appreciate that, Paul. And my earlier entreaties to you stand. Look, I've engaged as best I can with publishers in Canada. with the Canadian government. We're continuing to analyze the legislation in Canada. There are troubling aspects to it. It does include a link tax, which is unfortunate. And I think, again, not healthy for the ecosystem going forward. But it also includes, and I think this is a really important point, and it, hard to say, because obviously that was tabled legislation. It hasn't been passed. There's a long path to go between here and whatever the CRTC will end up doing in Canada. But the definition of organizations subject to that legislation goes far, far beyond news organizations. And I don't see how that's beneficial to the very news organizations, we're talking about and we've engaged with, right? As I mentioned in my speech, are we paying for organizations doing real journalism? Are we going beyond that to, lifestyle content, to sites which frankly are not doing original journalism, possibly even doing, false information that furthers the challenges of misinformation? So how we define, or I should say how in the end, the Canadian government defines those criteria, and this is similarly true in Brazil, by the way, is really critical. And I think, I would be very, very carefully focused on the fine print there. But again, Paul, as I've said before, I'd love to engage with you and members of the association. We've done it directly, as you point out, with many of the publishers there, and have achieved negotiated deals with many of the publishers, most of the publishers in Canada. But clearly, we'd like to continue to go forward.
Yeah, and Richard, you've always been very straightforward, and we certainly appreciate that and appreciate the engagement. And I agree with you in terms of sort of the legislation, the fine print, making sure that this is actually for news content. So we're 100% aligned with you on that point.
Great, thank you, Paul.
Roberto, ¿puedo?
Ricardo, por favor, adelante.
Sí, muchas gracias, Richard, y voy a tratar de tomar algunas cosas que se mencionaron en el chat. Primero, yo creo que desde los medios o desde las asociaciones valoramos muchísimo todos los esfuerzos que hagan las plataformas y lo que están haciendo, porque realmente están apoyando al periodismo y su sostenibilidad. En realidad, de la discusión que se trata acá, y que siempre se ha visto en esto y que ha generado debates en otros países, es por el tema de la remuneración justa que buscan los medios por el uso de contenidos que son monetizados por las plataformas para generar publicidad. Entonces yo diría, tu analogía, que también se comentó en el chat, fue excelente. Es decir, le exigiríamos a los kiosqueros que paguen por tener a los diarios para su distribución, que sería prácticamente la analogía con Google, que distribuye contenidos. Y un poco la respuesta es jamás, si no se genera dinero o publicidad o ganancias por parte de ese kiosquero, excepto vender el diario. Pero si ese kiosquero toma varios diarios, corta pedazos de otros diarios, hace su propio diario y lo vende, y pone publicidad y lo vende, es obviamente que un publisher de los demás diarios que cortó su contenido le van a exigir al kiosquero que pague parte de las ganancias que él ha tenido por unos contenidos que no le pertenecen. Entonces, en los medios estamos de acuerdo en la ayuda de la distribución de los contenidos. Eso está perfecto. Lo que se reclama es la remuneración por las ganancias de esa publicidad digital que utilizan las plataformas para monetizar esos contenidos. No se está pidiendo o no se busca una remuneración o un subsidio de parte de Google o de Amazon o de Meta, sino simplemente que se pague por un contenido de un creador que, como ya venimos reiterando en numerosas oportunidades, es la de creadores, la de productores que tienen que pagar salarios, que tienen que pagar impuestos, que tienen, etcétera, así como un cantautor o como alguien, un actor, cobra por los contenidos, así como una película que se distribuye también cobra por el contenido o por los derechos de autor, por otro lado. Es decir, en esa analogía creo que está un poco la diferencia entre lo que vemos que ustedes piensan como plataformas y lo que los medios reclaman, que es un reclamo simplemente de el uso comercial de esos contenidos. Muchas gracias.
Well, no, but let's go a little bit deeper in that, because what you suggested isn't what happens. Like, we don't copy and paste your content and assemble it into a product with advertising. It is very much like a newsstand, if not even less than a newsstand, right? We include your headline, a URL, and in some cases, a snippet. With a lot of news stories, as you know, at the top of search, it's just the headline and the snippet. That's all that's there. And unlike a newsstand, I can't pick up the magazine and browse through it and read an article or two and then put it back and leave, right? I have to click through to the site. And once I'm on your site, it's your revenue. So, I mean, frankly, I don't agree with that characterization in terms of what we do with Google search. You know, and in truth, with news, typically the headline is enough. You're very good at crafting headlines. You're very good at enticing people to click. Obviously, not everyone is going to click on every article that's listed in Google search, no more than they buy every magazine or newspaper that's on the newsstand. But to the revenue point, I mean, here too, I don't expect us to agree on this, but it's pretty clear if you look at Google search. First of all, the number of queries that are news queries is well less than 2% of all search queries. Like, right? I mean, you know, this where we make money is when someone does a query that says, I'm looking for the best refrigerator or air conditioner or whatever. And that's obviously where you'll see a lot of ads, and also sites that offer suggestions on what air conditioner you should buy. But if you look at the results against news queries, you hardly ever see an ad. And frankly, it's for the reasons you well know. You know, if you're looking for an article about, I don't know, a recent news event, that's not exactly an area of advertiser interest. I mean, you know that from your own experience in the newspaper business, right? They're not, the advertiser doesn't want to be next to the hard news content. So the amount of revenue we derive from the presence of news on our platforms is literally de minimis. I'm sorry, I think somebody was cutting in.
Entiendo, pero permítame, hoy tuvimos varios paneles de investigadores también de varias universidades de Estados Unidos, informes de la UNESCO, también estudios que han hecho desde el News Media Alliance. Es decir, y puedo citar otros y puede ser que no todos coincidan con las estadísticas que tiene Google. Pero obviamente se habla de que prácticamente un 65% de los usuarios de Google que buscan noticias de los medios se quedan directamente en la plataforma de Google y no son llevados hacia los medios en particular. Entonces, un poco lo que estuvimos discutiendo hoy es toda esta maraña algorítmica que obviamente permite a Google y a otras plataformas mantener a la gente dentro de su plataforma más que permitir que se vaya. Yo soy un gran consumidor de noticias de fútbol.
And I, you know, I've been engaging around the world on this, and I have yet to see an economic analysis which supports some of the points that you're making. And on that last point, you know, if I'm doing a search for red chili peppers or whatever, that might not be the best example. It's the only thing that comes to mind. We don't know the intent of the query. Are they looking for news? Are they looking for a recipe? Are they looking for a band? Right? Now, we try to, as best we can, understand the nature of the query and surface content that may or may not be what they're looking for. So yes, not surprisingly, They see a bunch of results and no, news wasn't what they're interested in. They click on something else, or they recraft their query to find what they were looking for. So it's far more complex than the suggestion that I do a query that might surface a news result and that they don't click, but it's not necessarily because they're not interested in the news story, it's because they're interested in something else. So again, these are very complex, nuanced questions. Again, always pleased to discuss further.
Señor, si me permiten una intervención, recuerdo sus palabras de hace unos minutos sobre el deterioro del ecosistema informativo, señor Gingras. Recuerdo también que en la mesa previa se hablaba de que la tendencia tan marcada a constituir con Google un monopolio publicitario, un monopolio en la estructura por la vía de su buscador, de las cuáles son las noticias importantes o cuáles no, con un algoritmo que es muy opaco, que la suma de esas dos cosas, un monopolio en sí mismo y una discrecionalidad tecnológica, si quiere, pero discrecionalidad en alertar a la gente cuáles son los contenidos más importantes, puede, en este mismo espacio de profundidad que usted propone, puede ser lesivo al final del día para la sociedad, para la democracia. Yo le preguntaría qué opinión tiene al respecto. Y una segunda cosa muy rápidamente. Cada vez vemos más esfuerzos de legislación en múltiples países. Cada vez más organizaciones internacionales no mediáticas alertan sobre la preocupación en materia de esta concentración en Google. En mayo próximo, la UNESCO está preparando una declaración en esta misma materia. Lo que usted nos plantea es que todos ellos están equivocados, todos ellos son víctimas de la retórica de los medios de comunicación o de una demagogia o de una realidad malentendida. ¿Cómo puede responder a esas dos realidades? Por favor.
Oh, I don't think it's that hard. I mean, it's a very, look, this is a very, very different ecosystem of media and expression than the one we came from, right? Again, I spend my time around the world meeting with regulators, meeting with civil libertarians, meeting with politicians. Their understanding of how the media ecosystem works is unfortunately deeply low. You know, I had a reference of a politician, I won't say where, who, you know, was looking for his local publication, clicked through search to his local publication, and had simply assumed that all the ads on your site were our ads, right? So these are complex questions. And I don't criticize people who don't understand. And as I often say, it's on us to help people understand, and others as well. But it's very complex and it's very nuanced. And it's difficult often for people to fully understand. I've had people come out and claim this happened in Canada. I can't recall who, and said Google sets ad prices too low. I went, but wait a second. All of our ad pricing is auction-based. We don't set the prices, the market does. More than half of our advertisers are small businesses because they have found that internet advertising is extraordinarily cost efficient and was something they couldn't afford through traditional media. So it's important to understand these things deeply. I'm not saying everyone's wrong. I'm just saying it's complex and we need to kind of get into the details. Now on algorithms, we take that role with extreme importance, right? We have gained the trust of billions of users around the world. We look at that data all the time, right? The trust and reliability on algorithms is core to us. So what's the answer? I don't think anyone here is suggesting that somehow the algorithm should be set by what? A government agency? Who? Who decides who decides? What I do think is a fair approach, and it's largely what we practice, if we talk about algorithmic transparency, is does someone running an algorithm, and whether it's an insurance company or a financial company or a search engine, are they being transparent about their principles? As I often point out, there is a 160-page document available to all of you about the principles behind the algorithm. I talked to a publisher recently, he said, could you send me a quick one-page summary? And I said, no, actually, the point is go to the detail, understand how we look at these things, right? We provide a lot of information about about our methods, how we do this within the bounds of security, because as you know, people are always trying to game the algorithms. But the third, which is important with regard to accountability, is enabling third-party academic research to assess the results. As I point out with Google search, we show our work every day. On any query, you can go back and see 100 pages of results. They can be analyzed. And increasingly, academic institutions are doing that. That's important work. That's important feedback for us to hear. And we do hear it because the algorithm evolves, the ecosystem evolves, people's methods of expression evolve. It will never be a fully accomplished work. And the only way we can get there is by feedback. I tell publishers, if you see a result and you don't think it was ranked properly, let us know. But send me the screenshot, show me the specifics, because we'll feed that into the team and we'll use that to continue to evolve our work. As you know, we've done a tremendous amount of work over the last several years on how we surface original reporting. We're doing a tremendous amount of work right now, which will be unveiled over the coming months, about how we surface local news, right? We know there are areas of improvement, and we know it's important to get your input in and have these dialogues, but we have to have the dialogues.
Muchas gracias. Estamos terminando. Ricardo tenía una última pregunta.
Sí, quisiera...
Una última pregunta y de consulta al presidente Canaguate si quiere cerrar con algún comentario final. Muchas gracias. Adelante, Ricardo.
Gracias. Quiero hacer una pregunta a Richard sobre...
I would like to bring it to a beginning.
Okay, sure. Una pregunta respecto al panel anterior, una reflexión que planteó Marcelo Reck, presidente de la ANJ de Brasil. Y él dijo, y preguntó retóricamente, ¿por qué Google se comporta diferente en Australia que en Brasil? Cuando lo que se busca es lo mismo, es la remuneración por los contenidos noticiosos.
I'm actually puzzled by the question because the environments were considerably different. First of all, there was 3 years of work that led to the Australian legislation. We engaged throughout on that. In the end, you might note that there were changes made to the legislation that allowed the government to assess a platform and decide whether or not that platform was subject to the law. In the end, Google was not designated under that law. Now let's look at Brazil. At the moment, the draft legislation, as I best know it, Article 38 is not more than 100 or 200 words long, not terribly specific at all. So again, these are very, very different situations. But I've said before, if we want to try to engage and influence that before it becomes untenable, we'd be pleased to do so. And again, particularly since and you know this way better than I do, I've talked to publishers in Canada, not just Latin America, saying like, gosh, the table legislation includes the cable, radio, and television authority in Canada. And I said, whoops, we just now have a government agency who's going to be looking over our shoulders. It's not just the platforms that they're going to be looking over. They're going to be looking over the news organizations, right? So, I mean, I think we need to really carefully assess what we're asking for and make sure that what we come forward with is something that we can both live with. I think the opportunity is still there in Brazil, right? Nothing has passed, but we need to engage. But there too, it was, again, late stage, a short article, 38, put into a much larger omnibus bill about fake news. And there too, in Brazil, that fake news bill creates an exception for politicians. Some of you might know, last week we took down what we felt were misinformation expressions in video by the president of Brazil. Under the new law, if that passed, we wouldn't be allowed to do so.
Muy bien, Jorge, no sé si Jorge está en el momento, Ricardo, pero si no, creo que...
Sí,
adelante, Jorge Canaguati, por favor. Para
solamente agradecerle a Richard de nuevo su presencia. Creo que coincidimos en que en muchos de los conceptos o los principios en la no intervención en la libertad de expresión, en tener cuidado en que estas regulaciones no incluyan o no se extiendan a eso. Coincidimos en ese apetito que tienen muchos políticos para poder controlar eso, pero creemos nosotros que debemos de avanzar más concretamente, Richard, en las discusiones en el tema central, que es el tema de compensación, en el tema monetario, en el tema económico. Así que, si me permites, yo te voy a enviar un email directamente a ti para pedirte esa cita, que nosotros entendíamos que estábamos yendo a través de las personas correctas y aparentemente no te ha llegado esa solicitud de reuniones como habíamos quedado hace 6 meses, que íbamos a continuar en un programa de reuniones para avanzar y tratar de llegar a un acuerdo sobre este tema. Así que te agradezco nuevamente y esperamos verte pronto.
Yes, and I really appreciate that. And I want to be clear. I don't want to say we've had engagements with a number of associations in Latin America. I don't want to be too doctrinaire about that. Clearly, we should engage more. There's no question. I wasn't aware of your request. The onus is on us. I don't want to suggest that somehow we're perfect here. We're learning along the way, right? I've been working at Google now over 10 years. I didn't come into this role thinking I was going to spend 80% of my time on public policy, which is now what I do. So we're learning along the way too. We have a lot to do and a lot to learn. So please don't take what I've said today as some indication that, we're right and you're wrong. I think these are complex issues that have deeply concerning secondary consequences. And I just hope we can engage and figure that out before we learn of those secondary consequences and it's too late. But I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. It means a lot to me.
Thank you. Ricardo?
Estás en mute, Roberto. Estás en mute.
Muchas gracias a todos. Creo que seguirán viniendo tiempos difíciles para todas las partes, pero creo que siempre será mejor que quede abierto un canal de comunicación, un canal de diálogo. Buenas tardes a todos, a todas. Muchas gracias nuevamente.